Thank you, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed this morning's Idea Lab session. We're going to move right ahead with our next event, which is the panel session. Very excited that we have an all-student panel. And I'd like to move right ahead and introduce our moderator for the panel, Gloriana Trujillo, PhD, who's Associate Director STEM here at Stanford University, along with a number of us in the Office of the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning. So without further ado, thank you very much, Gloriana.
Thank you, Richard. So as Richard mentioned earlier, based on feedback from last year's ATXpo, we've invited more student voice into this year. So we're pleased to have 7 students, hopefully one's running from class to join us, from 5 different institutions to share their experiences using technology in their learning experience. So we'll also be trying to make this session as interactive as possible. So we have the 2 microphones there for questions, and we'll be taking those roughly around 12:30, hopefully. But if you have questions before that, please feel free to go up to the mic. All right, so with that, let's meet our panelists. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself with your name, your institution, major, your favorite smartphone app, and maybe just a line about what that app does in case our audience doesn't know that, isn't familiar. So we'll start here with Ruqayya.
Hi everyone, my name is Ruqayya. I am a junior studying mechanical engineering at Stanford. My favorite smartphone app is TickTick, which is like a to-do list, like it helps organize your life type thing.
Hello everyone, my name is Doug Dunbar. I'm a 4th-year geology major at UC Davis. My favorite smartphone app is probably Snapchat, just because it's a quick way to engage socially with all my peers.
Hi, I'm Rachel Madura. I'm a 3rd-year history PhD student here at Stanford and also a graduate fellow at the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. My favorite smartphone app, it's a combination of 2. It's If This Then That and Todoist, which I learned about as like a productivity suite this summer where you can set up recipes to do certain things for you. So basically every time I get an email that I star, it gets added both to my calendar and my to-do list, which is pretty great.
Hi, my name is Advait. I'm a graduate student at San Jose State University. I'm doing my master's in software engineering. My favorite app would be BART Runner. Maybe some of you would be aware of that. So it tells me exactly how much minutes I should leave my office in so that I could catch the next BART. So yeah, that's pretty useful. So yeah, that's it.
Hi everyone, I'm Madeline. I'm a junior at Stanford studying computer science, and my favorite smartphone app is Uber because it is the only app on my phone that has fundamentally changed the way I interact with the world, especially as someone living on Stanford's campus who does not have a car.
Hi everybody. So my name is Scott Myers, and I am a 2nd-year pharmacy student from the University of California, San Francisco. My favorite smart app is probably Slack, which is the messaging application. I use it quite a bit.
Hi everyone, my name is John Scott. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley in Education and New Media, and I'm going to go with Trello. I was going to go Slack, but I'll go another project management. I quite like the card layout of Trello.
Great, thank you. So first question, open to everyone, is going to be about reflecting on your learning experience. So either inside or outside of the classroom, what tool, web app, or hardware device have you used that has had a significant impact on your learning? So what is that tool and why was it useful?
So unfortunately, I think with a lot of engineering classes, there aren't that many learning opportunities to use technology in the classroom. So what I've had to do is YouTube is my favorite thing ever. When there's not a concept I don't understand, I'm a really visual learner. I like to, if I understand something, it's because I've seen it in every form. So whether it's a MATLAB simulation video or there's a lecturer who explains a concept really well, my go-to is always, if I don't understand something, I YouTube it, and then I probably understand it better.
Probably for me is the iClicker devices. They're pretty common in really large lecture classes where the professor still wants to engage, but there's 500 students, so they can't just pull hands out. I really enjoy those just because frequently the professor will flash up a slide of the statistics, the breakdown of the response that the class made, and it kind of helps you place yourself as far as like, how have I been doing in this course, right? Like, am I keeping up? Am I getting these questions right? Or have I just been missing the ball on this whole unit and I need to read this chapter again? So I find that to be a really integral way that I focus my learning in the classroom.
So a lot of my work that involves technology would technically qualify as digital humanities, and one of the most valuable tools that I have used is something that came out of Stanford's lab here, which is Palladio. And so that's a web-based platform for easy data visualization, for doing network models, mapping. And that to me was really my introduction to putting data together and then visualizing it. As I work on 17th century documents, the process of taking that, turning it into data, and then turning it into a visualization was not entirely intuitive. So it was useful to have a tool that was relatively easy entry.
For me, it would be Stack Exchange. Stack Exchange is something that involves reviews of a piece of code where you are stuck in some, say, issue, and you have experts guiding you through that, or maybe experience of users who had similar issues and different ways of resolving that. A lot of my class projects would revolve around, say, application development. So whenever I would be, say, stuck at some point, this app would help me do the exact debug kind of thing that I would then explore in more detail about learning that. So that would be one app I would be using more often.
So a lot of the computer science classes at Stanford are very large, and I think because of that, it's very difficult to have interaction in them, especially when you have like on the scale of 770 people as there are in my AI class this fall. And one of the classes I'm in, a databases class, is experimenting with a partially flipped classroom setting. We're using something called Jupyter Notebooks, and we do some lecture and then we stop and we can use these interactive notebooks that they've put together to write code right in class and see if it's correct. So I think that's been a really cool way to experience a computer science lecture that's not all talking at you.
For me, and I know this is true for a lot of my classmates as well, the biggest change in education for us has been using Notability for our note-taking app. Studies have shown too that you remember more when you're handwriting rather than typing. So having the ability to just pull up a PowerPoint slide or whatever the professor's using, handwriting your notes, and then most of us also upload it into the cloud sharing service box, and we can share our notes with each other. So if we didn't catch something, somebody else did.
I've really enjoyed engaging with a tool called Zaption. It's a video tour app, and it allows you to, as opposed to just watching a video and kind of passively kind of interacting with a single video, instructors can piece together multiple videos into tours and embed different kinds of discussion and engagement points. And so it's a really nice way to move from kind of passively watching to more engaged interaction with your video content.
Thank you. So now like to move on to the challenges. So what challenges have you experienced in terms of technology in your learning experience? Not necessarily for everyone, so feel free.
One of the biggest challenges, I think, is professors sometimes get really excited about technology, but they don't necessarily structure it well. So I think iClickers are a really great tool, but oftentimes what happens is the professor will put it on the board, no one really talks to each other, everyone just kind of guesses an answer. You see that most of the people, like 80% of the people are right, and then you're one in the 20% who didn't get it, and the professor just kind of moves on. So it's important to use technology, but it's also important to like force some sort of structure where students are actually working together to learn.
I was going to comment on the iClicker system as well. I really like it, but it has its own downfalls. For instance, today, there's a chem lecture where there's an iClicker involved, and I gave my iClicker to my friend so that he could, in Davis, plug in an answer for me and I wouldn't lose attendance points. So technology has its downsides, but one of the cool things about the iClickers that I like is they're a tangible technology that I can resell as a student. It's not a code that a professor made me buy for $150. that then at the end of the quarter is basically valueless to me. It's something I can give to my friend if he needs an iClicker course and I'm not in one. It's actual piece of technology that I, as a student, take around with me as a student, and it's like mine, right? I value it. So that's kind of just another note on that.
So one of the classes that I've taken here is literary textual analysis course with Professor Mark Algie Hewitt, which was a fantastic experience. It involved a lot of, mostly I think humanities students, some CS students learning art basically, and starting from the ground up with a new programming language. I would say the biggest challenge was probably every time that a student had a technical difficulty, it really stopped the class. It just interrupted the flow. It was easy to kind of see people drifting off in terms of the tension. So I think that the challenge of getting everyone to the same starting point, even when it comes to skill level, never mind, having the right application installed, I see that as being a big challenge that's worth spending some time really trying to overcome before the course begins.
I'd like just to add on what Rachel said right now. So I had this course where there was like 80 people in the class. So whenever a professor or a student is stuck somewhere and he's asking doubts to the professor, it actually takes the time out from the professor's schedule, which somehow affects other students. So yeah, that is something that I have experienced in my courses as well. So I definitely look for, say, a seamless app kind of a thing that, say, would take notes from the student to the professors, and that would somehow help the professor and the student at a later point of time while resolving their discussion. So yeah, that's something.
I would say that if you're going to introduce some new innovative technology that students likely haven't used, make sure that it is pre-installed before the first day, or offer office hours before the first day of class, because although my databases class is running very smoothly now, the first day he sort of expected all of us to have it up and running, which was like very much not the case, and that sort of derailed lecture for an entire 30 minutes while like TAs frantically ran around trying to like debug different terminal issues that people had installing. So, and he hadn't offered any office hours before the class, so if you had a problem installing, like, there would have been no way to get it solved. So make sure that if you want to use those tools in the first lecture, that you offer opportunities for people to come to you with questions beforehand.
For me, I think the biggest challenge for students is an overcomplication of all the different web systems or platforms that classrooms use. A lot of professors want to use this thing, or some professors will use other things, and so there's a lot of confusion about, okay, so what are we using for this class, or what's going on in this class? Another big thing too, to sort of illustrate, too many systems. At UCSF, we use a Moodle-based content management for our courses, and a lot of times we can find our content there. But we also use this system called Ilios, which is our calendar system, which also contains a lot of our course content. So for some classes, you may find, here's lecture slide here in our Moodle-based webpage, or if you don't find it there, then it's going to be in the Ilios. So students get confused where to find certain course materials.
I think that asynchronous collaboration remains a challenge, both for myself as a student, and then also when I'm serving in a role of a GSI or TA. And I think that discussion threads have been kind of the bread and butter of online learning, and I think discussion threads can be really fruitful, but also it's fairly limiting, and it's a kind of stilted version of a conversation. And we don't participate in a lot of discussion threads in our everyday digital media practices. We do a lot more content sharing and dialogue happening around the content that we share. And so I think that when you dive into these discussion threads with lots of students, they get really long, they become really cumbersome to navigate, and they tend to orient the response to the instructor's prompt, and they're not really peer-to-peer at all. And so opening up opportunities for really authentic collaboration that can be both assessed by the instructor as well as kind of meaningfully situated in the process of learning for the student, I think would be a real enhancement to online learning specifically.
So on that note, related to collaboration, what sort of tools have you used in your learning experiences to collaborate with others? Maybe it's been something like a discussion online, but maybe it's something that's already mentioned. So if it is, maybe talk a little bit about what it was that you used and in what context it was used to collaborate.
This one is really simple, but all of my friends use Facebook Messenger. And so if I ever wanted to contact anyone about a PSET or what assignment was due or anything like that, it's always through Messenger. Probably the majority of my messages are about school rather than social stuff, just because it's so easy to use and everyone is on it. So if I want to sell my textbook to someone, like through Messenger. If I want to get help on a PSET, through Messenger. And it makes it really easy to connect with a lot of people at once. So that's the easiest way to collaborate unless you're face to face.
Taking more of the low-hanging fruit, just Gmail's ability to share docs, Google Docs, Google presentations. Anytime you have a team of people, being able to all access the same thing and edit the same thing in real time is an incredible resource that I've used countless number of times in college. It's hard to think of how you would really improve upon a system like that, but I'm sure there is a way, so that's what you guys are here for.
So my comment on this wouldn't so much be a tool as a structure that I thought that worked really well. So one of the other courses that I had taken here at Stanford was a spatial history course, where as a part of that, we began by breaking into groups that were interested in different forms of digital humanities. So more of a networking group, more of a mapping group. And then we spent that quarter actually working on a project together that would be something that we could represent both in poster and perhaps interactive form. And so this ended up working really well. The project was meant to be something associated with Stanford. So we reached out to the Cantor Center collection here and actually did a project about kind of the origins of the collection of the museum. They were great to work with, and it was just a fantastic experience of kind of real-world project management that allowed us to do some real application of the things we were going over in the class, both from a theoretical and a technological point of view.
In my experience, it would be HipChat. So HipChat is a product from Atlassian, which combines, say, your server logs, and it also provides you a seamless communication channel between your peers. So if you are in a project working on, say, different applications, and at the same time, it could update you with, say, errors or issues from the servers that are running, as well as you could communicate on that channel as efficiently as you would do on Slack. So that is an app that I think was the most helpful app for us while collaborating on a project.
My favorite collaborative structure is probably meeting in person while simultaneously working on a Google Doc or a doc sharing site. I would add to Google Docs also Overleaf, if any of you know it. It's a LaTeX online compiler that you can also use simultaneously. So I had two people both working on an algorithms PSET on Overleaf, which is really cool.
To kind of reflect too, most of our collaboration is done through Google Docs as well, especially in person where you're working on the same document that you need to turn in or the same PowerPoint slide. I would also say that there is some growing popularity in other systems too. For instance, in some of my classes now, when we get into a group presentation, we'll collaborate using Sway and throw a quick presentation together to display to the rest of the class. Much to the dismay of a lot of professors, a lot of the collaboration still remains on Facebook. I think a lot of professors don't like that because they can't see it, but I feel like that's probably why students like it. But again, I think collaboration really specializes into what you're collaborating. So Google Docs for primary documents, but I think there's growing areas too.
Yeah, I think that the panel is onto something in thinking about structure when we're thinking about collaboration, because collaboration is more than one tool, and it's usually part of a broader process. And so thinking about different tools that you can assemble together to scaffold that collaboration, to move it from kind of early brainstorming phases and more free-flowing discussion to more formalized composing like you would do it in a Google environment, to project management like Slack. I think all of those, and then also the social media as playing a really important role. I think for especially in the omnipotent eye of learning analytics, for students to get away from that gaze of Big Brother and have a conversation among themselves that's not being tracked by these systems is certainly a big value add for students in moving outside of the learning management system.
Great, thanks everyone. So we'd like to make sure we're hearing from the audience. So if you have questions, please step up to the mic.
I like what you said about so many discussions simply being about a piece of shared content. Are you John Scott? Mm-hmm. You just mentioned that casually, as if, for example, instead of responding to a faculty member's prompt, if the students were using the discussion forum to share content and talk about it as they would in other contexts. Because that's kind of what university is all about. I mean, it's this painting, this engine, this object, and then we sort of annotate it and learn how to use it by talking about it. Books are taught that way. And yet, I think the reason it's hard to do with technology maybe is that the scale has changed. So what I'm really asking here is for you to solve this problem for us. Can you think, is it that the content is shared, is like, look at this link is what I'm used to, and then everybody looks at it and says, oh, that's funny, right? So how would you do that academically, where the content is rich in the comments, but the object might be quite small? Do you see what I'm saying? Like if you do a 2-hour lecture or go to the museum and then comment on it, it's too late. Like what's the scaling that we need to change on to make that work for younger people?
Anyone can comment, of course.
I think that the scale of it is an interesting question because we hear a lot in the online learning literature about micro activities and various ways to kind of scaffold kind of micro contributions from students, right? And that's what we do in social media, right? We see something cool, we snap a picture of it, we upload it to our feed, and now suddenly it becomes this fodder for engagement. And I think as we start to really expand and break down the walls of the classroom and start to expand kind of how we bring students' worlds into our classrooms and allowing them to, as opposed to it being one link shared by an instructor, right? You may have a library of some kind where students can ongoingly curate content into that library and organizing it using it the same types of metadata or hashtags that we use in other types of content management systems, and really allowing that to become a kind of playground for thought and for engagement that isn't focused around that one kind of content item, but rather assembles. And I think that's such a huge part about 21st century digital learning, right? Is that we're always assembling various components and pieces of things together to make meaning as we assemble them across these kind of global flows of content and media. And so that opportunity to take these bits and pieces of things, piece them together, critically analyze them, deconstruct them, I think that would be a really rich opportunity for enhancing how we think about the scale of that content.
To add on to that, I think something that a few of the other panelists have brought up that's really valuable is that one of the key aspects is balancing that face-to-face time with the digital work. So I think that actually having a class set up where you workshop digital projects can be incredibly valuable. And that is that moment of using digital content to start a real-life conversation. And in addition to teaching students kind of the form of workshopping and giving feedback.
For me personally, whenever I'm given an option online to click on a link, I'm also given 18,000 other options. If I'm on Reddit and I'm browsing through things and I want to look at something small and then have this comment thread ensue, I'm given thousands of small options. So when I click on something, I'm already engaged with it, I already like it, so I'm more likely to go down there and comment and engage in that conversation. Whereas if I get an email from my professor who's saying, hey, I was talking about this in lecture, here's a good example that I found online, it's one link, right? This is what you should be interested in, now click on it and be interested in it, right? If there were 5 links and he said, hey, I've been talking about a ton of really cool stuff, If you're interested possibly in any of this other things, here's a slew of things that you could do your own research on, or invest your own time in, or maybe even have your own conversation about. And then that's, it's kind of casting a larger net. You're more likely to catch fish that are interested in that because there's just more choices there. And I think the choice is key. Reddit is a variety of choices that you then pick from. You can go to our science and then look for the scientific things you want, or you can just look at stupid pictures, right? It's choices.
Great, thank you. Another question from the audience.
Yeah, I'm curious to know with the sort of how technology has advanced in the last couple of decades, we have access to so much information, and there's information being pushed at you from all angles, from like what you mentioned about Facebook, from your professors, from your email. I mean, how does one organize all of those things, some of which are important, some of which aren't, and be able to respond to it without being constantly attached to your phone?
So I'm actually a big proponent of not having technology in lectures when it's not necessary. So I think that if you are using a piece of technology in a lecture or a discussion that is useful, then like by all means have it. But if you are not going to have any technology in the lecture, then tell your students that they cannot have their phones on in class. Tell your students that they cannot open their laptops, because otherwise what you get is you'll get a lecture where no one said like, oh, phones are not allowed, and you'll get everyone in class like, 20 minutes in is like checking their email, checking their Facebook, because like we all get notifications on our screens, and if you do not explicitly tell students not to look at their phones, they're going to look at their phones. So I think a lot of like keeping engagement nowadays is telling people that they cannot interact with technology in certain structures.
To kind of reflect on that, I agree with you completely. It's really disheartening to look around a classroom and see half the laptops have Facebook open rather than paying attention to lecture. But on the other side of that argument, it's not a slippery slope, but you create almost a distrust between the student and the faculty member. So for instance, the faculty usually have to scare the students not to use technology. And I think it's really important to keep that safe space in the classroom. And I think really that's where a lot of these problems come from. Students don't feel safe in the class to contribute. I think technology can help with that, like clickers and poll everywhere. But it's not an easy thing to answer.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about this idea of there's all this information out there, right? And what are the particular skills that we need to develop in young people to navigate that landscape? And it's interesting to think about it in relation to the talk this morning about the sovereignty of the institution, and it's typically been the role of the instructor, the professor, to do that curating of that information and to put it into a syllabus and to say, hey, this is the best stuff about this field that you should know, right? Typically it's their book that they wrote that they're trying to get you to read on it, right? But to as you start to think about the changing role of the instructor in the information age, to allow the students to develop those practices around data literacy, information literacy, and for them to be the facilitators of how students discover that content and critically engage with it, I think it brings a kind of a new responsibility or new face to how the instructor engages students with, now that information is everywhere and it's at everybody's fingertip.
So following up on the technology use in the classroom while otherwise doing another learning experience, what strategies have you seen instructors use to either condone or not technology use?
I remember my freshman year, one of my favorite classes that I took was mechanics. And on the first day of lecture, the professor, instead of just saying, phones are bad, you shouldn't use them in class, or laptops are bad, you shouldn't use them in class, he brought up a whole bunch of statistics. And it was really well done, but showing that while using a laptop in class might not affect you, it really distracts everyone around you. And he just presented it in a really great way to make everyone not only care about their own learning, but care about the learning of people around them. So from then on, I have refused to use my own phone in all of my classes, but also sit next to people or be around people who use their phones or laptops. So I think making sure that it's not just an evil teacher, who doesn't want technology in the classroom. It's really about learning and promoting learning. To make that clear is, I think, really important.
So this is such a small thing, but I think it can really help with that dynamic that we're talking about between teacher and student, which is sometimes the teacher admitting that they don't know something and actually asking students to provide the answer because they have that technology at their fingertips. So it kind of encourages more of a collaborative process, particularly when the question is itself from a student. Which, you know, happens to everyone as a teacher, right? That you don't have the answer at the top of your head, but somebody else can look it up within 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden they're engaged in a peer-to-peer process.
I'm in a class this quarter that doesn't allow phones or laptops open, and my teacher approached it the same way that yours did. He said, you might be the greatest multitasker in the world, and maybe you can check your Facebook and also pay attention to what I'm saying, but the person next to you is going to be looking at your Facebook because you're scrolling and some videos coming up and they're like, oh, like, what's going on? So it is not within your right as a student to disrupt the learning of the person next to you. And he also provided several articles on that as well.
For me, I think using technology in the classroom is a good thing. To keep students really in perspective of that they're in a learning environment and that they're here to learn or to be engaged in class. I think that's really the key so that they're not using Facebook or something else. I think giving students a reward in that sense or setting up a way to get a reward by paying attention is a good method. Again, quoting on Clicker and Poll Everywhere Technologies, having a question every once in a while so that you're maintaining your engagement with what the lecturer is saying, and then you're answering questions. And a lot of these questions don't have to be, repeat what I said, but they could be, how do I apply this knowledge to something new? And then you can use technology to look up. For instance, at least in pharmacy school, we look up cases. You know, here's what we learned about, oh, there's a disruption in this protein. Let's find a disease that's associated with it. Let's find a pharmacotherapy that will treat it.
Yeah, I think that you know, for instructors, what we really want to see is the tools being embedded in the curriculum, right? As being an innate part of what's being taught. That the technology becomes more invisible, right? I think the more invisible the technology becomes, the better it's being used. In the sense that it's a natural part of the learning. It's not an add-on. It's not something that requires a whole kind of runaround to get to just for the purpose of using it and saying that, oh, we used a piece of technology in the classroom. And I think that comes from early planning on the part of the instructor in setting up the technology usage, setting up the values and the practices, whether or not this is going to be a Facebook allowed course or if we're going to have time set out in our course to engage with Facebook. I think for each instructor to think about the larger curriculum that's built around the technology empowers the usage of it.
Great, thank you. What questions does the audience have?
Hi, I love the way this conversation started off with mention of single apps, and everything that the panelists have said has really brought it into a larger system, not just within the classroom, but within your lives overall, and in relation to how you interact socially with other learners and with instructors and with the community. So you're really talking about a systemic kind of process here that involves technology, as John was just saying, in invisible ways. So my question is, going back to the talk this morning where one of the helpful things that the speaker said will be happening in the future is that we capture a whole lot of what happens online in our digital systems, and that we can use that to really enhance our measurement. I want to know what doesn't get captured that you think should be measured about learning. What doesn't get captured with keystrokes that really is important in these ecosystems of learning that you've been describing, and how do you go thinking about the stuff that's tremendously valuable to you in your learning experience that won't be embedded in digital format?
I think a big piece that's lacking is that students don't get enough credit or enough incentive to impact the learning community, right? So typically, you know, we analyze, we assess students on a very individual level. We look at individual achievement. We tend to look at that achievement in very outcome-centric measurements. So how did you do on a test? And so we lose a lot of the process, but we also, I think, lose, and I think a great way, as you were talking about, to motivate students is to begin to reward people. You know, we have a participation grade, right? And that's typically like that part in the grade that's the most ambiguous, and it's, you know, that 10% the structure allots for you showing up and not sleeping, and you kind of get an A in that part of the class. But how can we really think about privileging and acknowledging all of the amazing contributions that students make to each other's learning, setting up study groups, sharing a helpful resource? I feel like that really gets lost in the scope of current analytics, and to reward and motivate that would be beneficial to the students in the short term, as well as preparing them for the workplace, where those skills and those dispositions are vital to current work environments.
To reflect on what John's saying too, I think another really important aspect that these outcomes don't really measure that well is creativity. How do you accomplish a new problem your own way rather than what the instructor says? As far as my knowledge, there's no good way to measure creativity other than, you know, how it affects yourself and how it affects those around you. And I think that's something that's very kind of swept under the rug in today's education. I feel there's a lot more importance on memorization, gaming the system, gaming tests, and that's not something that really carries with you outside of university, right? You want to try to find creative new solutions, and that's how you best find your place in the job market or in life in general.
This is on a slightly different note, but I think something that professors don't see just looking at what we submit and what we do online is the sort of collaboration that happens when you're living in a dorm with a lot of people who might be taking similar classes. So at Stanford, 99% of students live on campus, and you tend to live with people who are around your year. So like things that have happened for me are I'll be like walking through my dorm and someone will be discussing a problem on a whiteboard, because Stanford's gone to a lot of trouble to set up like interactive learning spaces with whiteboards and chalkboards and stuff like that in the dorms. And I'll be like, oh, like that's the problem for the class I'm in. And I'll like introduce myself and be like, oh, like what are you talking about? And get drawn into a conversation. Or like in the dining halls, you'll suddenly hear that someone's discussing an article that you may have read for a class, and you'll like sit down and have that conversation. Like that sort of thing can never be measured online.
Kind of tying in with the outcome-centric word John used, a lot of how I feel my feedback comes to me technologically at the end of a course is in raw stats, like what was the standard deviation of the class, what was the mean, how did you do relative to all the rest of the class. But really that doesn't help me at all, right? Like I turned in my work, I've already done it. That's just telling me like good job or bad job. What the important thing is like, did I use that information? Am I going to use that information next year? And that's almost impossible to keep track of, because that would require the system to stay in contact with me after I've already kind of moved past the system. But that is the analytics that like is useful. Like a student going into college would say, I want to take this class, because 90% of the students that came out of that class used all of the content in their life, right? Even if it was a class on how to file your taxes, right? Students might want to take it just because there's data there backing up how much the students appreciated that. And I don't know, a suggestion maybe like even if it was just emailing alumni and saying what was the most profound class you took at our campus. And that's probably already questions asked, right? But somehow applying that to look back at what did that class do differently than another class, or how did that class somehow like make this lasting impression? How did this content stick more? And then how do I communicate that back to our next generation coming into it is the key, I think.
So a little bit off that comment, I'm curious who's had experience using maybe a longitudinal portfolio type, looking back at what you've learned years ago, or maybe even a few quarters or semesters ago. Has anyone used that sort of approach to learning?
The closest thing I can think of is Zotero, where as a history student, and I was a history major as an undergraduate as well, I've been working on different variations on a theme for something like 5 years now. When I cite things, I add them into a Zotero library and kind of file them away. So it's essentially a digital replication of a physical library. And that's been enormously helpful for me now as I kind of start the dissertation process, is that I have all of these books where I couldn't necessarily recall exactly what the argument was with material, but I know that it was useful for X paper, and I can go look at that paper and see what I drew out of it.
Thank you. All right, so I want to go back to something that Doug mentioned earlier about the cost. So iClicker is something that you can take back and sell, but what have your experiences been in terms of cost of third-party tools, software, or textbooks, things that you have to purchase in order to participate in the course?
On one hand, I think technology can make the cost cheaper. Often, like PDF textbooks are cheaper than the actual physical ones. And you can, you read them on your laptop, on your iPad, or whatever. But also, when it often comes to software, it gets really, really expensive. MATLAB is $100. Anytime C or Java or whatever you're using, that's like another $100 for every class that you're going to take. If it's like a hardware-based technology class, that's like you have to pay for all of the materials that you're going to use to integrate whatever technology. Stanford does a decent job of subsidizing a lot of it, but it still basically comes down to at least $100 per technology-involved STEM course that I've taken. And that adds up really quick, and it makes it really hard for students who don't have the resources, because sometimes they'll avoid it. They'll be like, okay, I won't use MATLAB, I'll go to the computer cluster, and then they don't have the same opportunities as everyone else who does have the resources, who do have the resources. Something I think professors can do to mitigate this problem is there's a lot of open source free equivalents for a lot of the software, or textbooks, there are free textbooks online as well, that they don't use. And I think if they just made that switch, it would make a lot of students' lives easier.
So for me, there's kind of two technologies that I interacted with at Davis. One was the $100 code that you bought, and at the end of the quarter, it was basically worthless because you could access that information and you could look back at it, but you couldn't even interact anymore. You couldn't go open a new blank worksheet and redo it. And that technology I find really, every time I spend money on that, it hurts, right? I'm never happy spending money on that, even if I know it's going to help me do better in that class, because I know that that's just a lot of money going into this tool that I probably won't be able to interact with. But then there's this other tool where the campus is kind of invested in infrastructure that's already there. It's already, for instance, I'm thinking of the Keck Cave at Davis, which is basically just a visualizer where you can go and interact with data and models. And in geology, it really helps because if you have some complex layering, it's cool to look at it in 3 dimensions and kind of interact with it. That technology is super expensive, insane. I would never be able to buy an hour of that my own. But my professor can say, hey, I'm going to take my whole 30-person class up there, and everybody's going to get 3 minutes just to look at this stuff. And that's technology it's tangible, it's right in front of me, and it's not something where I'm not going to be able to use that tool next quarter, but I didn't have to pay for it in the first place. So all it did was expose me to possibility. It just opens my mind, and there's no negative or harsh feeling oh my gosh, I just shelled out all this money, and now I have to use this technology because I paid so much for it. It's more whoa, I get such a crazy opportunity to try this out. How could I apply this to some cool idea I had in another class? I don't know exactly how to make the textbooks not biting a bullet, right? It's hard to think of something like that. So.
I'd like to share one experience that I had in one of my courses. So it was basically an introduction to cloud technologies. So what my professor did is he spoke to the university and got a grant so that every student had a $100 credit to experiment on different cloud-based technologies. So that was something that I really appreciate from the professor doing for the students, so that he actually wants you to do a hands-on on the technologies that you're working on. So initiatives like that really would help you in case you don't have the infrastructure with you. And it is the case most of the times where, say, in terms of software, it works in a different way on a different system than it would at your local system. So testing that at a level that is, say, subpar to everybody would really help. So, yeah.
Honestly, the one technology that has always confused me is iClickers, because iClickers cost they're a little battery clicker with A, B, C, D, you push the button, and they cost $40 or $50 in the bookstore, and you can log on to a website, and I've had all of my physics classes used the iClicker, and then I had a CS class where the professor was just like, log on to this link and like vote. And it did the exact same thing and just like on your phone, and almost everyone already has a phone. So I was just like, why would you ever use an iClicker when you can do the exact same thing for free on the internet? But I don't know, maybe other people have insights into that.
I think if a student is given a choice between something that costs money and something that's free, they're always going to choose the free route. And sometimes that means an illegal route as well. I'm talking about, torrenting software or downloading textbooks for free, that sort of thing. So it does exist. And I know a lot of universities now are trying and especially hard to subsidize or provide the software needed by students. And a lot of companies are really good about it too. If you provide a .edu email address, you can have their software for free. Like Office 365 is a big one of that. I think the schools should really try to focus on, if there's going to be a cost aspect, limit your types of platforms that you have and pay for everything, if you will. So it's better to have less platforms that can help more people and cheapen our overall cost burden, if that makes sense. Because even if things are free or perceived free, we're still paying through tuition.
Do we have another question from the audience?
Yeah, going back to learning analytics, so your clicks and page views and answers. In the keynote, we heard about how the measurement revolution is coming to higher ed and how these learning technologies you're using in classes will offer opportunities to easily measure learning. How does that sit with you? Is it a good thing to be holding your instructors and institutions accountable using this data, or is it not? Is it creepy? What's your reaction?
I'm doing research with a lab right now that's actually looking at a lot of data for physics courses, intro physics courses. And one of my other lab mates was a data point. We used to joke about how it was kind of creepy that we had all of the information about her. But at the same time, it brought, looking at the data trends overall, it brought so much to light that we knew this is a problem with this section of learning, and this is why students struggle with it. And then having the data to prove that really forces instructors to do something about it. Because when you fill out your evaluations at the end of the quarter, they're like, okay, a lot of students don't like this section. When they have raw data saying that there was no growth at all for students, that actually forces them to do something. So while it is kind of strange for the data to be on you to be everywhere, I think it's really important to, like you said, hold instructors accountable to making sure that we learn.
Really, the only bad data is no data. So as long as there's more data, it's going to help somehow, but it always has to be taken with a grain of salt just because the diversity in learning is so big. There's slow learners and fast learners, visual learners. It's so different that if you're doing an analysis in the middle of a quarter, right, there might be people there that don't know what's going on at all. But by the final, they do know what's going on really, really well. And maybe it could be because they're a slow learner, or maybe it could be because they haven't even opened your book yet, and they're waiting until the end of the quarter because they're stressed out about something else. Either way, that data is never going to communicate that true story behind that person. So it always has to come with a little bit of grain of salt where you can say, hey, there hasn't been much improvement here, but there's also some room for error as well. But like I said, the only bad data is no data, so it can't hurt, right?
So one of my professors last quarter was doing his PhD on using machine learning technologies to look at, I think it was Khan Academy students, and figuring out which problems lay the fundamentals for other harder problems, and how you could if they had missed a harder problem, get them problems that were at the fundamental root of why they had missed a harder problem. And I think when I hear about stuff like that, I'm really excited about the use of technology, but I also think it's important to remember that things like machine learning can be very biased in terms of if they only get data from certain kinds of students, if they only get data from upper middle class white students or something like that. And you can see a lot of that in Google searches that only return certain kinds of pictures. So I think it's important to think that, to analyze the data in a way that's also non-biased and remember that.
I think learning analytics are important to identify students who are struggling in class, and I see that aspect as really important. But to play devil's advocate a little bit too, I feel that, this happened I think with the K through 12 schools, when you integrate all these learning outcomes and all these quantitative analysis to classrooms, it limits the potential of classrooms. So a lot of times instructors will then restructure their course to meet those learning outcomes. So you're bound into a box. You don't have that room to grow when the instructor structures his entire class based off of learning outcomes and ensuring that he gives all of this pieces of information. So from a more larger view, I think having the learning objectives shouldn't be used to penalize instructors into making sure that their class is formed in a certain way.
Yeah, I think it really begins with transparency. I think that we need to establish more protocols and better transparency in how the data is being used and potentially giving students opt-in, opt-out strategies for how their data is used, right? So for instance, when I use a piece of technology in my classroom, my data is being captured at an enterprise level, right? It's being distributed across the campus for whatever capture mechanism they have. It may be used in the professor's research project, which typically I'm going to sign a form to consent to that research. And then it's being used by whatever third-party service provider is capturing that data, who's using it probably in an investor deck somewhere or something like that. So you know, one of the projects that Berkeley is trying to pilot is an analytics dashboard where students would be able to see exactly kind of what's being tracked about them, how that data is being used. And I think that as we start to develop those protocols and software for that transparency, then we can have more critical conversations about the metrics and what exactly we should be capturing. I know I was at a conference recently and there's a university and every student is on a Fitbit and they're tracking their physical activity. And that would be an opt-out for me because I feel pretty uncomfortable knowing, you know, if they knew what I did on Friday night. And so I feel, you know, I think that those opportunities to have the conversation and to maintain transparency is really important.
Thank you. So we're in a room with people who think and care deeply about learning and student experience in the classroom. Let's do a lightning round through everyone. If it's not been shared already, what's something that you would like them to know about technology and learning?
So I was thinking about this before I came in today, and I wanted to say that if you can get your students creating tools, I think you're going to see so much more engagement. If you can actually show them that they can create something that then other people can use. And I say this because it seems like I think project-based learning is great, but a lot of the projects are kind of create a website. Then somebody could theoretically access that website. And I don't think that's taking it quite far enough. I think students are really invested in actually creating solutions to existing problems rather than simply creating another presentation.
I would like to say that everybody is really excited for the flipped classroom style of learning, but I say that with warning because a lot of professors, well, some professors want to make sure that they check all those learning outcomes that we were talking about before. So for a 2-hour class, you'll have 4 hours of preparation. So I want the course directors and instructors to remember that students do have lives and that we can't have, 6 hours worth of at-home preparation for one hour class. Although I do really like having the actual classroom for more problem-based learning and collaboration. I just want to reiterate, no 6 hours worth of information beforehand.
I'll just add, I think that being kind of product agnostic, and so really thinking more about what are the tools and the practices that I want my students to engage, and then looking at the products that are available and opening up options for students to use a different product that maybe they're more familiar with that can tackle the same types of goals and same types of issues. I think too often instructors are presented with technology in a very kind of demo, I'm trying to sell you this piece of software, as opposed to it being presented as this is a tool that you can manipulate in various ways, and there's lots of them out there, and let's find one that maps onto what you're trying to do as opposed to you trying to map on to what the technology allows you to do?
I would say be preemptively deliberate about what forms of technology you will and will not allow in your classroom, because if you don't make that decision before the first lecture, the students will make it for you on day one.
For me, I guess it's streamlining and consolidation of academic portals and just academia in general. At least I'm speaking for Davis right now. I can't totally speak for Stanford. But there's personally like 6 or 7 websites that I have to go onto just to keep track of what classes I'm in, when those classes actually are, what grades I have in those classes. It's a whole lot of stuff, and we're also in between switching from SmartSite to Canvas, which is a whole nother website, which means I get to learn a whole nother UI and everything. If there was some way to consolidate those, streamline those, make it so that me as a student, I think somebody was saying earlier how they're asking the question, how do we get people to spend more time off their phones and more time engaging? Or if they're on their phone, engaging with their phone? It's certainly not through having to log in 5 different web pages and then do a dual mobile check to make sure that it's actually you, right? If there's some way that you can confidently, securely know that it's you and have you access your academic portal as a single portal, I'm not going to be on my phone trying to remember a password for 20 minutes. I'm going to just be present and paying attention. So that I would greatly appreciate.
What I would say is that to remember the diversity in learning styles. So while one app or one web interface might really work for certain students who like to learn through, I don't know, whatever digital media you're using, not all students like using technology. A lot of them really just want like a pen and a paper and to like work problems out that way. So try to keep have multiple options for whatever your learning goal is, to like sort of make it easy for students to learn regardless of what their learning style is.
I would like to share, say, an innovative way a professor devised in one of my course. So he would, say, form groups of, say, 4 students each, and then had his TAs deployed at various points in campus. Then you have to solve puzzles, and unless you have learned the core concepts that were taught in the class, you couldn't say, even if you went to a TA, it's like a treasure hunt kind of a thing, that he later translated into a grading scheme, which was something that I found innovative. And also the things that I learned after the evaluation of those races, that, okay, this thing was specified to learn this. So it gave me a whole lot of new perspective of how things, or how the learning that I did should have been. So kind of introducing some out-of-the-way solutions would really help, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So that, I think, ends our panel with the students. Please join me in thanking the students for sharing their experiences.